jump right in. I just heard my puppy in the background start to do some puppy dreaming. So if you hear her, nothing to be concerned about. But yeah, let's kick this off. I will start by just introducing myself, and then I will pass it over to you, Tim, and we'll go from there. So my name is Breezy. I am the head of growth and marketing over here at Correlated, and I'm joined by Tim, who's also on the team. And I'll let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Breezy. Yeah, Tim, CEO and co-founder here at Correlated. And Breezy and I are going to be tag teaming this one today, each of us kind of going through a couple key pieces. But just to kind of set the stage, we're here to talk about product qualified leads. And I'll be going into this a little bit into the presentation, but just quick context for why we're talking about this. This is a topic that comes up a ton with the companies that we talk to and work with here at Correlated. I actually recently wrote a blog post about it as well. And one of the things that I wrote in the blog post, which we'll be covering, is that I felt like a lot of people are doing PQLs or product qualified leads incorrectly. That we thought there was like a better way to do it. And so I think as far as a discussion point, like areas where I certainly love to dig in with folks on the call, and we'll have a couple of these points throughout the presentation, are basically, are you doing PQLs today? Is that something that's a part of your process right now? What's the level of satisfaction with what exists today if you're doing it? And certainly would love to hear from folks who are practitioners. It's okay if you're not. It's okay if this is a conversation that you're joining because you don't have any kind of formal PQL process in place. That's totally fine. This conversation is for you as well. We definitely want to kind of cover the bases of, what does it mean to put in PQLs? Like, what are some of the prerequisites there? How are companies, both large and small, doing it? So we'll be doing, those are the kind of core topics we'll be covering. So if you've never done it before, that's fine. If you're kind of an expert, we want to hear from you. Please chime in and tell us kind of how you're doing it. So I think maybe the best place to start, and Breezy, you're going to kick us off, is kind of defining what a PQL is, and then we'll go into a little bit more on kind of our unique point of view on PQLs.
Perfect. Yeah. So what are product qualified leads? I think starting with a definition is always the most boring way to kick it off. But if we don't have the foundation, we can't build a house. So a product qualified lead, I think everyone probably pretty much knows what an MQL is, right? So it's activities that someone's done, whether it's on our website and attending an event, whatever it may be, combined with things like what is their title and what size company are they from? How many employees does the company have, or what territory is it located in? So similar to that, a product qualified lead is taking that information that you have on the MQL side about the title and the company size, but instead of adding in that marketing information, we're adding information about things that they've done inside of our product. And so I think just kind of looking at it that way and breaking it down really simplifies it. So a PQL is going to be adding in things like, okay, they invited 2 users, or they logged in more than usual in the last week or month. They hit certain usage limits inside of the product. They tried out a different feature that they haven't tried before, things like that. Then one of the other core differences, and we'll dig into this more, but just to sort of intro the idea, is that we generally only have one definition for an MQL at a company. And so one of the big differences between MQLs and PQLs is that for PQLs, you have multiple PQL definitions at a company, especially as you scale and grow that company, because there's all these different points in a life cycle where it's going to make sense to talk to someone who's a product user. So maybe it's that first initial time when they sign up to use your product and they've taken a couple key actions. But then once they hit the next usage limit, because in a product like growth company, it's all about these different expansion opportunities. And so you want to have kind of multiple definitions across that customer life cycle.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Breezy, for the intro. I mean, I think, so this is the header for the blog post. And so I wanted to maybe talk through really quickly, and there's more reading here, which we link to at the end of the presentation. We'll send this deck around as well. There's more kind of in the blog post, but there's a couple key reasons why we feel, a lot of companies at least are making a mistake when they are kind of rolling out PQLs. So the first mistake is kind of what Breezy alluded to before, which is in many companies, MQLs are like that single score. So you have like this threshold where, okay, and now all of a sudden it's a marketing qualified lead and that gets passed to sales. And so in a traditional kind of enterprise sales motion where it's someone comes to your website or you meet at a trade show or, all the different steps that might get to that MQL threshold, it makes sense then to pass it to sales who qualifies that, has a demo, does the sort of normal sales process before then hopefully closing the deal and then passing the customer to customer success. That's a very linear process. In PLG, when you have a customer maybe from day one that swipes a credit card and is just using your product, that kind of linear process isn't the same. It doesn't exist really. And so if you're just using one score to say, okay, all of a sudden this is a product qualified lead, you're missing that whole kind of life cycle that could define when a customer actually should be engaged by sales or engaged by customer success or engaged maybe by an SDR team or a solutions engineering team. There are all these different kind of touch points. And so we feel that just using one score really misses a lot of that complexity and sort of nuance that exists in product-led growth businesses. I think one of the other challenges that we see is that because of the difficulty in sort of getting product data into a format even to like use successfully, a lot of times the PQL score is almost completely owned by the data team and maybe growth marketing as well. And so that's fine, that's good. Obviously, we love our colleagues on the data side. They make the world go around, and it's essential to have those folks helping us every day. But I think when it's completely owned just by the data team, and you're not able to, as a maybe SDR manager or a CS lead or someone on a VP sales, if you're not able to sort of test and manipulate maybe the scoring or the thresholds that you want to have your team kind of go after, if that's kind of all held on the data side, that can lead to the business team not really being able to iterate and see what's working and what's not working as they try to layer sales on top of kind of that PLG self-service motion. And I think the last thing, and I alluded to this in the top bullet, but basically there's no way to customize that single score really for kind of the complex customer lifecycle. And we'll get into that a lot more in subsequent slides. So I'll say more on that in a moment. I think kind of going to the next slide, we want to just have a quick opportunity for people to chime in here. And the discussion point that I'd like to lead with, if anyone's willing, and I won't actually call on you, don't worry, but if anyone's willing to chime in, would love to hear from folks in the audience on whether or not they have a PQL methodology today, and also whether or not any of the mistakes that I mentioned resonate or not. If it's going really well and you feel like what you're doing today is working really well, would love to hear kind of both those things. So if anyone wants to share, please chime in. If not, we will continue. But we'll love to hear from the group if anyone has any thoughts. And if you are eating that sandwich, I'll continue to stall for time while people think about replying. If you are in fact eating that sandwich and off camera, if you want to just type in a question or response into the chat, that's also totally fine. And you can type that in at any point, whether or not I'm on a slide like this or not. You can just type it in, toss questions our way, no problem. All right, well, with that, we'll kind of go into a little bit more on why we think a single PQL won't cut it. If you want to go back to this and talk a little bit about how you're doing PQLs at your company, chime in the chat, totally fine.
Yeah, I tossed it in there. I'm looking at a couple faces. Okay, simple PQL here. All right, so Andy's using PQLs. Is anyone else looking at that product usage data today? Okay, simple PQL. What is that? Just anyone who signs up to use the product? Is that kind of like V1? Yep. Okay. Not really calculated. No problem. I'm just curious. Nice. It's like super common. This is like, what we're talking about is like the vision, right? Like that's where you want to get to. So that's part of the discussion today. All right, cool. Well, feel free to chime in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you. Cool. Well, let's talk a little bit more about why we think, a single PQL score, kind of this overarching score, is kind of an oversimplification. I think from our perspective, what we hear talking to leading companies, public companies like MongoDB or Twilio, Slack, down to like massive private companies like Calendly and others, all the way down to startups, Series A, Series B, startups that are starting on this journey. If you have a PLG, kind of a self-service type part of your business. And then you're also layering on sales, success, other kind of go-to-market teams that have a human component. There's a sort of customer lifecycle factor to consider when considering how you do scoring and how you think about your process internally. And so, again, I alluded to before that traditional enterprise sales cycle. In that world, it's so clean, it's so easy. You know, marketing responsibility is kind of here. There's always some nuance. You have lifecycle marketing and the old B2B, but you know, you kind of have the top of the funnel. They own that. And sales is responsible for closing a new business, and then they hand off customers. The CS is responsible for retention and expansion and upsell. A lot of those same lines are still drawn in PLG, but the challenge really becomes, you know, the ante is kind of brought up a bit when you have this self-service component and a way for people to seamlessly start using the product. And so you will often see, you know, PQLs used at the top of the funnel for acquisition, which makes a ton of sense. Like, are people in like a free usage or free trial starting to actually start to use the product? And so you get into activation a bit more. And then you often see that's when kind of traditionally that PQL score is used by sales or the SDR team to say, okay, now they're starting to activate. We'll hit them, you know, they're in this 14-day after sign up free trial. Maybe we'll start to hit them with a bit more concerted messaging. The challenge though is, and where we see a lot of companies not spending a ton of time where we think they should, is what happens once that customer converts? Or if you have a pure self-service motion, what if they convert as a self-service customer, they swipe a credit card, but there's all these maybe enterprise tiers that they could be upsold into by sales. When should sales, you know, after conversion get involved? When should they talk about expansion? Or a lot of the companies that we talk to and work with have a multi-product portfolio. So when should sales or customer success or even the lifecycle marketing team get involved to cross-sell? What should those thresholds look like? What should the scoring or the PQL type factors be if you want to do expansion or cross-sell? And so this is core to PLG companies and a really big challenge, and where we think a lot of the companies that are doing PQLs today aren't really considering kind of some of these nuance and ramifications. And so before I go further, I have been noticing out of the corner of my eye a couple of comments in this in the chat. So I want to just quickly go back to that and just look. So it looks like Leilani said that there's loads of valuable points, but not systematized or used across the board. Okay. Andy added in, there's some transactional stuff going on. And then Oz, you said that there's technically a PQL, but you're not naming it yet. Okay. Well, you offer now because you offered. Thank you so much for doing that. I'd love to hear what your process looks like, and maybe we can use that as a jumping off point for a little bit about what we see with other companies we're working with.
Absolutely. Hey everyone, my name is Oz. I work at a predictive index talent optimization platform, and we do have our legacy platform, and we are now gradually switching into product-led growth with offering some free value exchange in the process. And right now we're doing it with a release candidates process. Right now our general availability will be sometime around May, and what we're doing is we're basically inviting these users, which we think could be a good fit based on the lead grading system that we released. So what happens is people go into that link we send them, they fill out a form, and they get for free, they get access to our platform, which has never happened before. Technically, these are product qualified leads, but how we got them is through lead grading, which is basically took some firmographic data, graded those leads, basically how we did in business as usual motion. Now we're very careful with naming conventions, how we kind of label these users. And the second process that we're still working on is obviously getting the product data in our marketing instance and kind of like merging them, because before we've never had anyone who is not paying us using our product. It was always a demo or something like that. So we're now seeing some product engagement by those PQLs, and we now have to bring those into our lead system and merge them and say, hey, these 3 people at company X are, engaging more with your product. Maybe a customized playbook, a discount, or something like that could be offered to them. So this is where we are now. Still pretty, you know, in the introductory phase, but yeah.
Cool. Thank you for that overview. And one quick follow-up question, and I always loved, you know, I could probably have a million questions, so I'll keep it to just one. Do you intend to go to a full kind of free tier or freemium type version of the product? Is that the plan over, you know, over time, or what is your intention with kind of the product side?
For sure, we will have, right now we have 4 products, Hire, Inspire, Design, and Diagnose. And we will be offering, ideally, sometime in 2023, we'll be offering, you know, a freemium motion for all 4. But we will be continuing the business as usual process in the meantime, because we have a huge partner network as well. We have about like 500 partners. We want to make sure they're taken care of as well during this process. So it's a delicate balance.
Well, it sounds like a big undertaking, and certainly one that I'm sure poses some fun challenges and fun opportunities. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
One other question came up from Chris into the chat, so I wanted to address that quickly. The top question, Chris, we're going to go into how our clients integrate PQLs in a lifecycle. I'll show you some examples of that. And then your second question around, can someone be both a PQL and an MQL? Actually an interesting question, and if anyone has thoughts on that from kind of their best practices, you know, what we see often is that, like, true, I guess what I could call sort of true PLG type companies, they will basically just use MQLs, but they'll have PQLs, but they'll have like a firmographic and demographic component to it, as well as like maybe some like website browsing, like some of the traditional factors that might go into an MQL, they'll kind of layer that in. So they'll say, you know, I want to know, do they fit our ICP? You know, are they kind of the title or whatever? Have they maybe done enough website hits or gone to certain content that we think is important? And then are they also a user, or are they in an org that has usage? And what are the different components of that usage? So they'll kind of combine all those things into one score. I haven't heard too many companies have like a separate MQL plus PQL, but maybe Breezy you have, and would love if you have to share there. And if anyone else is doing both at the same time, would love to hear thoughts from the group as well.
Yeah, I have heard from a few companies who basically tried to keep these as almost like 2 separate funnels. And I will say that it didn't go incredibly well. And the reason for that is because there's going to end up being inherently, there's going to be sort of a mixing of the 2 funnels if you try to keep them in that separate format like that. So for instance, someone might sign up to have a demo, but then they may sign up to use your product. And so then which one of these do we want to keep them in? So I think what's proving to be sort of the best practice is if as some of these marketing activities are also important, like Tim mentioned, including that sort of in those different scores throughout the customer lifecycle. We use both, but we have multiple go-to-market strategies based on company size currently. Yeah, I think that can make sense. I mean, if you have some part of your motion that is, I don't think you should just throw the MQL out the window. I think there is still a place for it, especially if you do have a strong outbound motion and things there. But just know that it won't be like some sort of clean, perfect cut between the 2 different paths. The path previously was very linear, right? Someone became a lead to an MQL to an SQL opportunity, whatever kind of your path was. And in product led, it's not quite so linear. It's sort of like a jagged line or a circle, however you want to think about it. So it will have some messy pieces to it, but I think it is still a good way to track some of the people in your pipeline. So.
The last thing I'll say to Andy's point, which is, it is a good one. We talked to a lot of companies that have that characteristic where they'll have a self-serve business and then they'll have sales going after maybe strategic enterprise mid-market kind of tiers, and maybe the self-serve piece or PLG piece is a bit more SMB. But what often happens, I won't name the company, but we hear that sales at mid-market enterprise strategic will just go dive right into the self-serve users and customers if they fit the sort of that, whatever the sort of stratification is there. So they'll kind of constantly be dipping into the self-serve bucket for good leads, obviously. You know, so even if it's like not aligning with like the MQL approach, like it's almost ad hoc happening. So you know, every company does it differently, and it's I think part of why we're helping here and talking about this topic and building Correlated is to help build coherent and consistent playbooks to help solve this problem, to maybe avoid misalignment across organizations and across teams. So okay, well, let's dive into a couple of the key pieces here. So, you know, I mentioned before like what we thought some of the common, you know, mistakes were. Well, okay, how do we recommend at Correlated that you actually do PQLs across the customer lifecycle? So first things first, instead of like a single score, we recommend using these concepts, which we'll go into in a moment, called signals and playbooks. And basically, you can think of signals as comprised of different characteristics, whether firmographic or demographic, and then product-based, that, you know, indicate where a customer might be in their life cycle. Are they ready to go from that activation to maybe a sales conversation and convert? Are they maybe more mature and they're already spending a lot, but they're ready to be cross-sold? Are they ready to expand? What are some of those different signals and different characteristics that go into that? And then what are the playbooks that align with those signals that your teams should utilize? Should it go to the customer success team because it's more of an expand or cross-sell playbook and they're going to run a certain way to try and get expansion to occur? Or is there an SDR play here where it's more of a top of funnel kind of conversion out of that self-serve piece? So we think that's the right way to do it. And we'll be going into some tangible examples in a moment. Piggybacking on what I just said, a second bullet here, we'll talk about this a little bit more. You should segment who responds to PQL. So obviously in that more traditional enterprise sales motion, you kind of have a really well-defined playbook of, you know, passing off that lead, maybe to an inbound, SDR, BDR resource who's going to do some qualification, or if it's going directly to sales, they'll do some qualification before then getting into the, you know, the sales process in motion. That's all top of funnel and kind of linear path. With PQLs, especially if you're going to do kind of this more you know, segmentation type strategy using signals and playbooks, you kind of have to think through, you know, who's going to respond to it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then you know, we can help but put number 3 in here. You know, we fundamentally believe this would really help, and we've seen it help a lot of our customers. But you know, using a tool, it could be ours, and there's other tools. What we will mention to be very transparent. There's other ways like you can do this. It's not just using Correlated, but there are ways you can obviously enable the business team with customer data. We'll talk a little bit about what some of those tools look like. So going into signals and playbooks, and this is going to be, you know, a lot more detail is going to go into this when I go to some examples in a moment. And we've talked a little bit about this, you know, so I'll skip like the first bullet, but you know, essentially what we recommend is, you know, breaking down by both accounts and users. So really trying to understand, you know, not just on a user or traditional like lead level, you know, what this person is, but also on an account level, you know, who should you be targeting on the sales side? One of the reasons why account level targeting matters so much is that in a lot of PLG type businesses, there's a huge top of funnel that's so big that you don't even know, you know, which accounts you should be targeting. And so I just got off the phone earlier today with someone that got 100,000 leads a month. So, you know, when you have that, I mean, everyone would love to have that problem. Of course, it's a great situation to be in, but it also presents a challenge where, you know, a lot of those are maybe you can throw them out, but even so, after you've kind of done some just really simple filtering and qualification, it's still a huge, no matter how big your team is, you can't really handle that. So doing both a user level kind of segmentation and an account level segmentation based on activation is really important. And then we think that there could be multiple different playbooks that you take based on sort of the signals that are being triggered. And so that could be maybe a marketing automation play, maybe triggering sales or SDR team to do direct outreach. Maybe it could be the customer success team focused on existing champions or existing buyers in more of an upsell basis. Maybe it could be some mix of all 3, in fact. And so how do you orchestrate that? How do you decide, you know, what the playbook should look like? Well, we're going to tell you some of our thoughts, at least in a moment. On the last bullet, so tooling, obviously, I think we went backwards. Breezy. Oh, I think we're on number 3. Sorry, thanks. I appreciate it.
A pesky pinky finger.
So obviously correlated. I put that as the last bullet. Like we could help, and we'll explain. Especially if anyone wants to follow up after this to learn more about us, we can tell you a little bit more about how we help. I think what exists today, what many companies that we talk to are using right this moment, are some combination of BI tools like Looker or Tableau, and then their existing CRM to basically arm their teams with at very least like the information they need about what's going on with these PQLs, with sort of the users or accounts. And it's often possible to kind of get some of the playbooks in order using this set of tools. So the first bucket is BI tools, as I mentioned. There's a newer category of product, which some of you may have heard of, called reverse ETL. They can help you send some of this data into existing platforms like Salesforce and HubSpot. I think the challenge is, with just doing this, there's still a lot of manual effort involved. And existing tools like Salesforce and HubSpot are great. We have integrations with them with Correlated to help enable teams to use those. But both those platforms don't really deal with product data that well. So if there's any kind of like change over time in terms of usage of a product, kind of trends that indicate an account's ready to expand because they just saw a huge boost in some sort of key product metric, that's not really well reflected at all in a Salesforce or HubSpot. They're not designed to handle that. So there are tools that exist today that can help. We think we can really help. And obviously, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. And obviously, if someone wants to go deeper on that, let us know. So let's go into some examples. So what we have here in a moment, basically kind of 3 examples of some signals for kind of 3 lifestyle stages: conversion, expansion, and cross-sell. And what the signals mean, and like what you should be thinking about as you're building, what we call signals. And then some of the playbooks that kind of go from there. And so let's start with this one. The company name is a sort of dev tools product that allows you to track issues as an engineering team and maybe track tickets. It's called Tickets R Us, great company. And so, what we're sort of imagining here as like a conversion signal, based on some, live experience talking to companies that might have products similar to this, is basically you want to have some mix of firmographic information that kind of fits the ICP, as well as some kind of activation signal. Because if you have a ton of signups, you might have a huge top of funnel for self-serve of people just kicking the tires, trying you out. And so you might get a ton of signups, even from great companies that fit the title, like VP Engineering, which would be someone that's obviously going to be putting in maybe a ticketing platform. And maybe at the sort of firmographic level, like, employee count is high. This is a sort of in our wheelhouse, it's a growth stage or higher company or whatever the stratification might be. But if you're not also layering in some level of momentum around maybe inviting their team in the last week or the last day, it might just be someone kind of clicking around by themselves. They're not really ready to talk to sales yet. But as soon as they start inviting their team in, that means it's going into active use, and sales getting involved right at that moment is really important. And so in this particular instance, this signal would be then sent right to the right salesperson that got assigned this account and given them sort of a task in Salesforce in this example to talk to them. And then what you could also do, and what we see a lot of companies do, is they'll pair this kind of segmentation with their marketing automation platform, say HubSpot, for example, and they'll say, this is maybe an example of a great segment of users that they're the org admin, they have the right title, they're in the right kind of firmographic fit, and they just invited a bunch of teammates in the last week. Let's add them to a specific onboarding sequence that's actually tailored to that persona, and have them get a personalized onboarding email that talks about their kind of like level of business, like 50 employees and up, their kind of title, so it's personalized maybe to VP of engineering, that sort of thing. So these are the kind of strategies that we see really work well for conversion, that have a better chance of sales kind of responding quickly to the right lead at the right time, because they're seeing it based on this like kind of activation moment. And they're also added to marketing automation in case sales gets ignored, which we all know sometimes can happen. Then they're kind of added to this like more personalized onboarding drip, which is a higher level of getting sort of a response and actually getting them to reply and maybe dig in a bit more. I want to go to the two others, but before I dive in to expansion and cross-sell, I want to talk, see if there are any questions on this kind of conversion playbook.
I see one from Chris here. And if you want, Chris, you're welcome to ask it live, but otherwise I can read the question for you.
So oh yeah, Chris, feel free to ask a little more, or I think everyone, it's public, so you can read it in the chat, but I will give you my kind of answer to it. If anyone else has any thoughts on this, would love to hear it. So there's kind of two ways to think about it. What's very common in PLG is there's this workspace concept. So in traditional enterprise software, there's the account and then there's a contact. If you think about like Salesforce, you have your accounts, you have your contacts in Salesforce, just two things. In PLG, there's often this third thing, which can be confusing, but it really matters. And so that third thing would be a workspace. So for example, in Chris's example here, for Google, you would actually care a little bit more about like how many workspaces and then people in those different workspaces are joining. Is there velocity in workspace creation? It almost doesn't matter that Google is this massive company. You would want to see that there's actually like a lot of kind of groundswell around that usage across different workspaces, different users in there, because there could be different teams are using it. And you would then try as a salesperson maybe to use that as an example to go to central IT, or to try and like find out who the champions are within those different workspaces to then try and cross-sell into other, expand into other teams that are adjacent teams. So I think the like total employee count can matter for segmentation, but it also matters a little bit on like the velocity or addition of these workspaces and that concept. And we see that time and time again in PLG, especially when those PLG products are being adopted by bigger companies. So like the total company size matters less than sort of adoption within the company. All right, I see a question from Elizabeth, and so I'm reading it now. So give me a moment, and then I'll give my thoughts. If anyone, while I'm reading this, if anyone has any thoughts on Chris's question, let me know. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, and what we see a lot of PLG companies do. So to summarize Elizabeth's question, and obviously everyone can read it, essentially many PLG companies view the free tier or their self-serve tier as kind of this, kick the tires, try before you buy type of, tier, and you're gonna have maybe some value there, but there's gonna be feature gating. There's gonna be limits that you impose to that, that part of your product, that free product, that, it's either users are limited, usage is limited, there's some cap or some gating that occurs. And so I think this is not an easy thing to solve for by any means. And so I think it's really hard to crack, and it's a combination of a product and go-to-market problem. But what some of the best companies will do is they'll find a way to like organically and nicely get people to transition from that free product to the paid product. And that could be on a credit card. So you still might not talk to sales, but there'll be some, very, interesting hook to a free user that says, hey, I'm ready to go from free to paid. So it was a long time ago when I converted to paid, but I'm now remembering Calendly, which we're customers of. And I believe Calendly has, you can get like 10 meetings or something for free. There's some number, I believe they do meetings getting, if I'm getting this wrong, forgive me. But, once you're starting to use it, you're like, oh, like I'm going to probably do more meetings than this. And it's like a pretty, convenient product. Like I'm going to convert myself up. So, some people might just be fine in that, limited tier, and yeah, use it for nurture, send them content. They're on your newsletter, they're seeing your product updates. And some of them might self-select to convert up or be a hand raiser to sales. I think that's fine. I think where we see companies like Calendly engage sales is often when those people have gone from free to self-serve credit card deals, and then they're trying to look at some of these signals around, are they inviting a bunch of people, are they creating new workspaces, are there some trigger events once they're even paid that then says, okay, sales should parachute in and talk to them. So hopefully that helps answer your question, Elizabeth. If you have any follow-ups, type them in or let me know. Yeah. So if it's just free and then sort of more of an enterprise lift, and this is a product problem too, right? It's like, where is there that gradual happy path to go from free to a sales motion? And it's often not just a go-to-market problem. It's also, or not problem's the wrong word, but it's not just a go-to-market task to figure out. It's also a product task to figure out, like, is there a middle area that you can invest in? So but we see a lot, very good points, and a lot of companies are navigating that transition for sure. All right, well, let's move over to expansion.
Example, yeah, good questions. Keep them coming.
So expansion is a bit of a catch-all bucket, but what we often see in product-led growth is, because of that dynamic I just mentioned a second ago of like Calendly, where you can really start spending a lot on the product without talking to a human being. The name of the game for the salespeople, for the teams that are actually trying to get conversions that are maybe on an invoice that are driven by a sales process, they're often coming from already paying customers, already existing customers. And so the question then becomes, what are some of the signals that might indicate an account that is otherwise maybe somewhat happy as a self-serve customer, or maybe they were on an invoice and they're just kind of humming along? What indicates when a salesperson should come back in and say, we think it's actually time for you to talk to us about XYZ higher tier, or this more seats, or whatever it might be. And so what we often see, I mean, it sounds intuitive, and it is, but what we often see is, whatever your pricing model, as soon as your customers are hitting some of those upward bounds of whatever plan they're on, whether if you price on seats, if they've exhausted most of the seats, if you price on some usage basis like credits or API calls, or whatever it is, there's so many permutations. But if you're getting closer to that maximum percentage of usage, it's a really natural point for sales to get involved. I think another example for expansion is the one I just gave before when Chris asked about Google, which is when we see multiple workspaces created. And so this is often a sign for those enterprise or strategic reps to say, okay, we're seeing at the Tesla account that there's 3 new workspaces that were just created this month with 40 or 50 users in each of those workspaces. We need to map out what those teams are, how are they starting to adopt us, and are there other teams that we can expand into? And so one example there, it's a simple, I didn't include it on this this illustration, but one of our customers has a very simple model they use, but basically they'll pull in enrich total employees for a company, and they have a product where they can sell licenses to 100% of all employees at their customers. So they look to get 100% penetration, but they'll often start with smaller than 100% penetration. So they'll basically look at how many seats or licenses have they adopted, self-serve or sales-led, and what is the total employees? Is there a big delta there? Well, then sales should be focusing on the ones with a high activity score, where there's like a big delta between the total employee count and the total licenses they've purchased, where there's a big room to upsell. And then maybe where renewal date's not like right, coming up right away, but is maybe a little bit around the corner. So if there's like some positive signals around usage and adoption, but they still haven't adopted all the way, then that's a good signal for sales to focus on that account, maybe versus other accounts that are a bit more penetrated or not showing quite the same level of action or activity. What we often see from a playbook standpoint are a couple of things. One, especially for enterprise and strategic, sales, just telling them about the account is enough, right? Like they're spending a lot of time on those accounts, they're mapping them out. So just a Slack message or adding to Salesforce and saying, hey, this is like this is hitting some nice thresholds. It's time to focus on this one. Like that's enough for enterprise or strategic. If it's a bit more of like a commercial or high velocity bucket, like an SMB or mid-market type bucket, then we often see outreach used. So or SalesLoft, those kind of email automation platforms, where you can start to automatically add kind of users that are within these accounts based on different rules, you might set whether or not they're the org owner, or if they're a decision maker is flagged in Salesforce. You'll see them added into sequences. You can start to have sales at least assisted in how they're doing that outreach, if it's on a more of like a long tail or a larger set of accounts. So those are some examples of kind of signals and playbooks for expansion. I see Chris's question, which alludes a little bit to the last one, but I'm happy to cover here though too, which is a good one, which is how to identify the most important signals in a free tools usage that indicates a customer is likely to convert. So this is a question we get almost every conversation we have, which is great, Tim. Sounds cool. Correlated sounds really cool. What signal should I use? And the short answer is, well, we don't know because everyone's business is different, but there are some common themes. And I think we can certainly help point people in the right direction. And so my typical answer to this is, even if you have just like starting to begin to look at your product data and understand sort of the core metrics there, usually you'll start to have 1 or 2 or 3 core metrics that indicate there's an activation occurring. And we've given a couple examples of different products that like I'm a customer of, like Calendly is a good one. So for the free product of Calendly, a core metric for them is how many meetings are being set with Calendly. Like that's ultimately what the job of that tool is to like help you set meetings. And so a core metric for them is, are you setting meetings? And so, for a free tool, like let's say Calendly, for example, the more meetings that are being set, maybe the velocity of that happening either on an individual user basis or across, a team's workspace, that's going up, a bunch week over week, month over month, whatever it might be. That is a pretty good indication that a free tool, a customer there is likely to convert because they're just using it more and they're using the product in the way that it's the highest value, the best sort of activation metric. And so that's going to be the reason why I say I don't know, is because every company has like a different one of those activation metrics. So I can't, without like knowing what that is, I can't tell you, but it's usually 1 or 2 or 3 of those kind of core metrics of like, where's the kind of value in that free tool? Where is it? What does it look like for that specific product? That's how you identify kind of the most important signals. So that hopefully that helps, Chris. That would be my kind of high level answer to that question. Anything else on expansion before we dive into cross-sell? And we're just a couple slides away from wrapping up. We can do a little Q&A at the end. All right, so let's go into cross-sell and talk a little bit about that. So for cross-sell, basically it's a little similar to expansion. I think the kind of main differences here are you want to look at, some level of product usage and firmographic usage. And then you might have to have a slightly, to Chris's last question, a slightly better understanding of some of the tip over points where other customers have converted to new products, so it might help to have a little bit more of like past history there and understanding. But, essentially, if you have an understanding of like, we know in our customer base that when companies, so this example is a business credit card company called Slope. And they sell virtual credit cards for small businesses. And so, in this example, Slope offers obviously a credit card. They have other services though. They have banking, they have expense management, anything you might need as a small business, on the financial side, they're starting to offer upsell opportunities there. And so obviously you can self-serve your way into that, but when should sales start focusing on specific accounts? What is like a cross-sell signal for something like a Slope? And so for them, it might be something like, okay, is there a certain amount of cards deployed, a certain amount of spend already happening? So they're a good customer already. They're kind of already kind of active. They're hitting some level of maturity. Are we maybe seeing some growth in their spend? So they're kind of going up in their spend, and they have a certain amount of employees. So maybe they hit a firmographic level that kind of matters. We know the level of complexity here. Well, in that case, because of these different criteria, both product attainment as well as kind of some firmographics, we know that that's a good fit for our expense management product. So we're going to, anytime an account kind of crosses those thresholds, we'll send a Slack to the salesperson that owns that account and say, hey, this account, whatever account that you own here, within Slope. They just hit these thresholds. You should try and ping them about expense management. And then I think, again, for kind of more of that long tail in particular, you can add them to sequences, whether it's in marketing automation or a tool like Outreach, saying, hey, we saw you're hitting these spending increases. Typically, when companies hit, this threshold of spend on Slope credit cards, expense management becomes much more of a focus. So, we have functionality there. Whatever the sales pitch is, you can imagine the content being paired there. But those kind of playbooks really help drive cross-sell instead of waiting. What we see often a lot of companies before they talk to us is oftentimes they're waiting to get a hand raise saying, hey, I want to learn more about expense management. Whereas this like feeds kind of the right companies right to the salesperson. It gets them kind of being more proactive on doing the cross-sell than they might otherwise be. So let me pause for a second here. I want to take questions on cross-sell, of course, but I also want to go back to the chat because I did see another question here. I want to take a chance to read it. So if you're coming up with questions on cross-sell, please go for it. And I'll be just reading Chris's question here. Yeah, so Chris, you're coming up with some of the common ones here that we see. And
you're
so,
not alone, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing to come off mute, one question I'd have just clarifying: are those free users attached to the domain? So like they're the same domain, so they're part of the account, or are they unidentifiable because they're not on the account domain?
Yeah, so they'll have the domain of the account, but like for large enterprise companies, if somebody has like an @Google domain and you have like 15 different workspaces for Google, it's really challenging to figure out what workspace, if any, that this particular user belongs to.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is, especially if it's a large enterprise account, and I'd love to hear if this sounds right to you, but like typically we'll see that like owned by a strategic rep. And so maybe it's a good use for like at salesperson's time because they only own maybe a handful of accounts to say, this week I'm going on a mission to like round up these free users and I'm going to like individually email all of them and say, hey, thanks for using the product. I happen to be the relationship point of contact here. Would love to just learn how you're using it and see if you can get any of the, some percentage of those 250 to reply. So it's almost more of like you're like being a consultant, and then that might help you if you get maybe some percentage of those people to reply. You can start to map out, oh yeah, well, I'm part of this team. We're just trying to, so you start to do it. So it's a bit more manual, I would say, a little lower on the automation side of the spectrum. And obviously, a strategic rep might not view that as the best use of their time, but I think often we find that kind of more manual approach makes sense for the strategic side. And you might uncover within that sort of free usage pool some interesting people you hadn't known before. And so the best way to filter through, at least our recommendation, is like just stack rank those 250 in terms of activity within the product. And then you can maybe have a top 10 or top 20 of like super users that are like just seem like based on their usage, they love the product, they're in it all the time, they're using it all the time. And then you can start your focus there as a strategic rep and say, hey, clearly you love the product, happy to I want to know a little bit more about that. And, I'm your point of contact. Would love to just hear how we can help and see if you can get someone on the phone to uncover cross-sell. Cool. Well, I know we have like 3 minutes left. So I want to make sure we kind of get to the end here. So let's go maybe to the building the business case piece, and then we can answer any follow-up questions. So, I think the biggest thing here on how to start to execute on this is, basically where can you get access to the data? So that's one of the things that we really help with. We have connections in our product to data warehouses. And so most of the time within companies, once you get to a certain level of maturity, your data team is utilizing a Snowflake, a BigQuery, or Redshift to consolidate all of your company's data. And that includes all your customer data, whether it's from the CRM, product usage, whatever it might be, billing, whatever it might be. And so to build the signals that we showed you, especially if you're using Correlated, you just plug in your data warehouse to our product, and we allow you to build those segments. If you're not using our product and you're using, whether it's Salesforce directly or CRM directly or a BI tool, again, that probably sit on top of the data warehouse, and you would have, that feeding into those different tools. And so, oftentimes we recommend, as you're starting out, if you're on more of the go-to-market side of marketing, sales, CS, whatever it might be, the data team is going to be your best friend to help you get started. Before I started Correlated, one of my co-founders, Diana, who's our head of product, she was, we didn't have a data team. She was the data team at my prior company. And we collaborated very closely to basically solve this problem manually at the company I was part of. So that's kind of the process we see, especially as startups and you get more to maturity. I think also as you get further along, your operations team is super important. They're often liaising with the data team as well and putting kind of everything together into the CRM, into other downstream tools, into Correlated, whatever it might be. And so making sure they're bought in, matters a ton. And then finally, I think this was maybe should be hopefully a little easier, because at the end of the day, the goal here is to drive, tangible business outcomes, revenue, core metrics. And so, building a case around, hey, we think this will have a meaningful impact on conversion rates from free tier to paid, or from expansion from sort of the self-serve piece to sales deals that have a higher average contract value, whatever it might be. And we can certainly, if anyone wants to talk offline, talk to you a little bit more about like the ROI case here, whether you're using Correlated or just trying to build support internally for this sort of thing. So those are kind of the top recommendations that we would have. And I think I have now spoken more than enough. So I would love to open it up for any final questions. But otherwise, we really appreciate all of you logging on. And I think we'll end with just, we're going to send this deck around. We'll send the presentation link around so you can have the recording as well. And I did write a blog post about this. So if you want to kind of go a bit more on the written word, you can check that out too. So any final thoughts, final questions before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time. Great seeing you all. And if you have any questions for us, feel free to ping us directly on LinkedIn, email, whatever. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone.
All right. Have a good one. See ya.